I got my first drone a few years ago as a Christmas present for my brother. It was a small, cheap thing, barely even bigger than my palm, but it was enough. I was hooked. Before getting one, I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but now suddenly I had a reason to be. Open fields, empty parking lots, even my own backyard. I'd go out and practice for months, learning how to hover, drift, roll, bank. It became a full-blown hobby before I even knew it. Once I felt confident, I upgraded. I saved up for something better, a real drone. This one had power, range, and most importantly, a camera. It had a sleek black frame, a solid battery life, and streamed directly to my phone. It was fast too, way more responsive than the toy that I started with. I spent hours watching YouTube tutorials, learning how to push it to its limits. I got good, not like professional level, but good enough to trust myself in tight spaces and risky maneuvers. And of course, really, really high places. I started taking it into interesting terrains, riverbeds, abandoned lots, hillsides. I like seeing things from above, places I could never reach on foot. There was just something about flying it that gave me a little thrill, like I was seeing through a bird's eyes. Sometimes I'd just cruise over empty streets at night, watching from above, as if I was a ghost. And that's how I ended up where I did, deep in the wilderness outside of town. There's a stretch of the canyon land that I've been meaning to check out for quite some time. It wasn't a state park, nothing official, just this wide, untamed sprawl of rock and trees where people would hike, maybe even camp if they were brave enough. The kind of place that didn't have actual trails, just endless terrain with steep drops and deep ravines. Perfect for a drone flight. The day that I went out, the weather was pretty perfect. No wind, clear skies. I drove down this dirt road until I found a good launch spot, a small overlook where I could see miles of trees spilling into the canyon below. I powered up the drone, synced it with my phone, and lifted off. The forest stretched out in every direction, green and gold in the afternoon light. I kept low at first, weaving through the treetops and testing my control. It handled beautifully. I banked, rolled, shot up high, then dove straight down, threading between branches. The camera feed was crisp, the world shifting beneath me in this smooth, gliding motion. Then I decided to pick a target, a long, jagged strip of granite running down into the canyon, like a scar into the earth. I used it as my guide, following it lower, deeper, the world narrowing as the walls of the canyon closed in. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to see something that I was not supposed to. I continued to descend, the granite vein guiding me as I dropped into the canyon's depths. The shadows stretched longer down here. The sunlight barely even cut through the jagged cliffs that boxed me inside. The drone's camera feed showed nothing but endless rock, broken up by patches of dense pines and brambles that clung stubbornly to the canyon walls. I was fully locked in, fingers feathering the controls, adjusting the yaw, shifting the tilt, smooth and steady. Then I saw some kind of movement. At first, I just assumed it was an odd rock formation, maybe fallen trees. But as I adjusted my angle, I realized that it wasn't. It was people, a group of them, tucked between massive boulders, hidden inside the canyon's fold where no trail would lead. They stood in a perfect circle. I hovered, adjusting the zoom on my phone screen. There were maybe a dozen, all facing inward, standing completely still. My stomach did a little flip. It couldn't have been a hiking group, that much was obvious. They definitely weren't dressed for it. They wore these strange loose clothing, robes maybe. No backpacks, no gear, nothing that said casual explorer. There was one in the middle too. He or it stood apart, slightly elevated on a rock facing the others. He wore a mask, something pale and featureless, like an oversized doll face. Beneath that, long black hair spilled down his shoulders, super long and thick. A wig maybe, perhaps even part of the mask. He lifted his arm slowly, as if giving some kind of sermon, though I couldn't hear a damn thing. I swallowed and just kept watching. I'd flown over people before, hikers and bikers, even couples having picnics. Nobody ever looked up, but this was very different, and this felt wrong. I wasn't recording, and my thumb fumbled for the button, but before I could press it, they began to move. All at once, every single person in the circle tilted their heads back. Their arms shot up in unison, fingers all stretched out towards the sky. A silent, eerie gesture that sent a ripple of cold through my gut. Then one of them pointed straight at my drone. It wasn't gradual, there was no hesitation. 1 second they were locked in on whatever strange ritual they were performing, and then the next they were staring directly at the camera. Their faces, half obscured by the shadows, looked blank and unreadable. Then they lunged for the ground. Not all of them, just a few. They bent down so fast, grabbing at something before I could react. Then I saw the first rock fly past the drone's camera. Shit. I yanked back on the stick, climbing fast. Another rock whipped through the air, missing by inches. A third. They were trying to knock it out of the sky, and if they did that, they could potentially trace the craft right back to me, as it literally had my name written on the wing. I banked hard and tilted away from them, but I was still very deep in that canyon. I needed to climb and get above the treetops, where I had space to maneuver. I tilted up and gunned for open air. The granite vein, where the hell was it? I scanned fast, fingers sweaty on the controls. There. That long silver scar in the earth, winding up the canyon side, my way out. I followed it, angling up. My heart was pounding harder than it should have been for something as simple as flying a drone, but it wasn't just flying anymore. I was running. Trees blurred past, higher, faster, almost out. Then, a crack. The camera spun. The feed tumbled wildly, whipping between sky, rock, treetops, then nothing but leaves, branch, and impact. And nothing but static. No. I swore, tilting the controls, trying to get some kind of response. The screen showed nothing but frozen distortion. My drone was down. I just sat there staring at the screen, heart jackhammering in my chest. I could just leave it. It wasn't cheap though, but it also wasn't worth my life either. Those people, whoever they were, whatever they were doing, I didn't really want to get mixed up with it. But then my gut got the better of me. It had the flight footage, the whole thing. If I lost the drone, I'd lose that too, and no one would believe me if I just told them what I just saw. I sighed and ran a hand down my face. I had maps in my car, printouts, satellite images. I could find a way down, if I was careful. Go in, quickly grab it, and be out before anybody knew what I was doing there. At least, that was what I was telling myself. I got my gear together, a flashlight, a knife, just in case, then started my descent into the canyon, into the place I should have just left alone. The climb down was pretty brutal. The canyon was even steeper than I thought it was. The rocks were loose under my boots, and the pines closed in deeper every step I went. Every once in a while I had to stop and check my position against the printout maps that I brought with me. There's no cell service out here. If I got turned around, I was completely screwed. I kept moving, scanning for anything familiar, especially that granite vein, the spot where the drone went down, the boulders where I saw them. After around 30 minutes of searching, I found it. It was laying half buried in pine needles and brush. One propeller was cracked, but otherwise still intact. Relief hit me hard. I crouched and reached for it, but then a sound. A high-pitched warbling. It echoed throughout the canyon. It was thin but sharp, like voices singing, but wrong. High and stretched, like somebody pulling their vocal cords past their limits. My stomach clenched as I looked up. They were coming. A single file line emerged from between the boulders, moving slow and creeping along. The same robed figures that I'd seen through the drone footage, those same blank faces. The leader still had on that mask, doll-like features staring straight ahead. Even their arms swung in this eerie unison as they walked, feet crunching lightly against the dry brush, headed straight for me. I grabbed the drone and turned, scrambling back up the incline. My boots slid, dirt and leaves spilling under my heels, but I didn't stop. I could hear them behind me now. They weren't running, just moving. The sound of steady footsteps and shifting fabric, that warbling, high-pitched voices stretching over the trees. Were they singing? I didn't look back. I climbed hands and knees, clawing at rocks, lungs burning, heart slamming against my ribs, just to get out, just to reach my car. By the time I saw the tree line thinning ahead, my legs were jelly. I stumbled forward, tripping over roots, grasping at whatever I could. The car was there, right where I left it, sun glinting off the windshield. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, locked it. I stole one final glance back toward the canyon. No one, nothing, just trees, rocks, and empty silence. I didn't wait a moment more. I started the car and tore out of there, kicking up dust as I hit the main road, only breathing again once I saw streetlights ahead of me. Later that night, I went through the footage, watched it again over and over. The silent ritual, the pointing, the rocks, the frozen frame just before impact. Then I started searching. Forums, old newspaper clippings, anything about the area, that canyon, that group. It took hours before I finally found something, a single mention, buried deep in a decades-old thread. Rumors of a cult, one that lived off the grid, only seen by those who went deep into the wrong places like that canyon. I quickly shut my laptop. What started out as this weird incident and curiosity rapidly devolved into something creepy and just all too real. I'm a drone pilot, not a conspiracy guy. I quit researching almost as quickly as I started it, and I never flew out there again. I don't know why I decided to go that year. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe some weird guilt that I didn't really recognize at the time. I was scrolling through Facebook one afternoon when I saw a post from my cousin Jake. Something about the annual family reunion happening at that usual spot. A big campground out in the woods, miles from anything resembling a town. I hadn't been to one of them since I was a kid, back when mom and dad would load us up into that old station wagon, make that long drive out there. I barely remembered half the people that I'd even be there, but something about it pulled at me this time, a last-minute impulse. Jasmine, my fiance, was not thrilled about the idea. She didn't say it outright, but I could definitely tell. She gave me that look when I brought it up, the one that meant, "Are you sure about this?" But she agreed to come along anyway. She knew I'd been feeling disconnected lately, like I was floating between things, and maybe she thought this would actually help. The drive itself was pretty long, 4 hours from the city. The last 30 miles just wound on these dirt roads that looked like they hadn't seen maintenance in at least a decade. Thick trees on either side, tall pines that swallowed up the sky. As we arrived, the sun was dipping below the hills, air cooling fast around us. The place really hadn't changed. A wide clearing, a handful of scattered cabins, tents everywhere. The reunion was a pretty big deal for my family. People would travel from all over the state to be here. Dozens of cousins, uncles, second cousins, great aunts. The kind of family tree that sprawled out in every single direction, more like a family forest, honestly. We actually got asked if we were Mormon quite often. We parked and found a spot to set up, a little patch of grass near the tree line where we could have some space but still be close enough to the others. I saw my parents first. Mom hugged me tight, like it'd been 10 years since we saw each other, instead of the 2 months since I'd just last seen her. My little sister Emma was out there too, along with a flood of relatives who came by to say hello and to meet Jasmine, ask about our wedding plans, our jobs, our lives. Jasmine handled it pretty well, but I could tell it was taking a toll on her. Too many names, too many faces, the overwhelming warmth of a family that doesn't know you well but insists that they do. That night we wandered off into the main camp. Fires were lit, food was cooking. Somebody had a grill going and somebody else was passing a few beers around. The air smelled like smoke and charred meat, the sound of laughter rolling between the trees. It felt good, like maybe I had been missing something all this time. But that feeling alone would not last. The night settled in, the stars stretched endlessly overhead, scattered bright against the black. The firelight flickered, we laughed, passed around bottles, and Jasmine and I stuck close together, soaking all of it in. I was starting to feel glad that we came here. The beer was cold and the food was indeed pretty good. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged somewhere again. Maybe it was the nostalgia, maybe the warmth of being surrounded by people who, even if they were practically strangers, still called me family. The night stretched on, and little by little, people would peel away, heading back to their own tents or cabins. The voices dimmed and the fire burned lower. Jasmine leaned in, resting her head against my shoulder. "It's kinda nice out here," she admitted. Her voice was soft. I smiled. "I told you." We sat there for a while just listening to the crickets and the distant murmurs of the last few campfires still burning. I wasn't tired, not yet, and I don't think she was either. "Want more beer?" I asked her. She nodded. "One more." I stood and stretched, but the cooler was empty. "I think I saw a big barn or something through the trees earlier," I said to her. "Probably a storage shed or something. They gotta have more drinks in there." Jasmine hesitated. Barn?" "Yeah," I said. "Kinda weird actually, I don't remember it being here when I was a kid." She just shrugged and we started walking. The ground was uneven, roots snaking through the dirt. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The firelight was fading behind us and the woods were now closing in, trees packed tight. The barn appeared through the gaps in the branches, hunched and weathered. It wasn't falling apart, but it wasn't exactly well maintained either. Its wood looked old, aged to this deep gray. The roof was sagging slightly in the middle. I hadn't noticed it before, but now standing in front of it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't belong out here. Jasmine ran her fingers along the wood. "Feels off," she said. "Like, why is this even out here?" "No clue." I grabbed the door handle and pulled. Locked. Guess that's that," Jasmine said, exhaling a laugh. But I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. I stepped around the side and ran my hand along the wall. There's gotta be another way inside. Jasmine sighed but followed me. We found it, a smaller door around the side, slightly ajar. As I reached for it, this instinctive warning flashed in the back of my mind. Something just felt wrong. But in the moment, I ignored it. It's just a barn, just a storage shed, nothing more. I pushed the door open. The smell was what hit me first, a thick, earthy scent, like damp wood mixed with something sour, something familiar. It was like body odor. The space inside was massive. The ceiling was lost in shadow. Wooden beams stretched out overhead, and along the walls, shelves lined with old tools, rusted saws, and coils of thick rope. And then at the center of the room, people. At least a dozen of them, completely naked, standing in this loose circle. Their bodies were smeared with something dark, some kind of paint. Crude symbols and shapes were covering their arms, their legs, and their faces. They were silent, completely. Hands raised, fingers gently touching the skin of the person next to them. Their eyes were all closed. At the center of it all, a man taller than the rest, with his back to us. He was smeared in paint too, his skin covered in swirling, uneven lines. His head was shaved, completely bald, and down to his spine, the symbols continued, jagged and rough like they'd been carved there instead of drawn. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. Jasmine squeezed my arm so hard that it began to hurt. Nobody moved, at least not at first, and that's when I noticed all the people on the ground around them were having sex. That was the smell, not just the body odor, but actual sex. The man at the center spoke, a single word low and slow. It was nothing I recognized, something old and foreign. Latin, maybe? I don't know. Then Jasmine made a noise, a tiny panic gasp. The man then turned. The people on the floor froze, and for a second, we were the new focus. His face was painted completely black, except for 2 white rings drawn around his eyes. His mouth was now stretched open, lips curling around another strange word. The others moved, fast. They started lunging toward us. Their movements were jerky, scary. Arms outstretched, fingers clawing at the air. In a sick, twisted moment, I thought I recognized one of my cousins and one of my aunts under all that paint. The hell were they doing out here? Obviously, I didn't have time or any interest to ask. I grabbed Jasmine and we ran. We tore through the trees, branches whipping in our faces, the cold air burning in our lungs. I did not look back and I didn't dare to. That uneven ground was hard to run on, but we didn't stop. Not until we saw the familiar glow of campfires ahead and the distant hum of conversation. We crashed into our campsite, breathless, shaking. I fumbled with our tent flap, yanked it open, shoving Jasmine inside. I followed and zipped it up, and then we just sat there, trying to get our breathing under control. Jasmine was shaking. "What the fuck was that?" she asked me. I didn't have an answer for her. My heart was still slamming against my ribs. My body was still fight or flight mode. Brain still refusing to catch up to everything. "Was that a cult?" she said, her voice barely audible. That had to be a cult, right? What else could that have been? I just shook my head. I don't know. We sat there listening, but outside everything seemed to be normal. The fire crackled and I heard somebody laugh. Nobody seemed to be looking for us. Jasmine then swallowed. "We need to leave." I nodded. "First thing in the morning, we will." Neither of us slept that night. Every little sound outside would make us flinch. Even the wind moving through the trees, the distant voices. I just kept expecting to hear footsteps creeping toward our tent. The slow, steady rustle of somebody trying to circle us. But nothing happened. Eventually the sky lightened and morning came. We were still alive. The second that sun was up, we started packing. Neither of us really even sang much, just moved fast, stuffing sleeping bags, collapsing the tent, throwing everything in the car as quickly as possible. Every now and again, Jasmine would glance toward the trees, like she expected to see them standing there watching, and I felt it too. It felt like we weren't alone, like something had now shifted, like we stepped over a line that we were not supposed to cross. We needed an excuse though, a reason for why we were just suddenly bailing. If we just disappeared, people would notice, ask questions, and I guess we couldn't risk that. "Well, say we have some kind of appointment," I muttered as I yanked the cooler into the truck. "Something back in the city." Jasmine just nodded. "Fine, whatever the hell gets us out of here." But before we could leave, there was breakfast. The whole family gathered at main camp. A long line of people plating up eggs, biscuits, bacon. The smell of food should have been comforting, right? But my stomach was twisting at the smell of it. Something felt off. And then I noticed the way they were looking at us. And by them, I don't mean everybody. Not my mom, not my little sister, not the younger cousins, but some of them. A handful of people scattered throughout the crowd. Older relatives, a few second cousins, an uncle I barely remembered. They were watching us. Not angrily, just kind of like suspiciously. Jasmine saw it too, and her grip tightened around my wrist. And then I noticed something worse than that. The paint. Little smudges of it still on their hands. Faintest streaks of it along their jawlines. Careless, like they tried to scrub it off but missed a few spots. My skin crawled, and I forced this fake smile. Kept my head down as we ate, acted as normal as possible. Pretended that we weren't seeing what we were actually seeing. We said our goodbyes quickly, and I hugged my mom, waved to my sister, gave a few nods to the rest. My uncle clapped a hand on my shoulder, grinning. His fingers lingered just a little too long. "You should come next year," he said. Jasmine then pulled me toward the car. "Yeah, we'll see about that," I muttered back. "No," he said again. "I mean, really come." We fucking bolted out of there. The second we were inside, I locked the doors and we were gone. I didn't even glance into the rearview mirror, I just drove. The road stretched along behind us. The trees finally thinned. The sky opened up. And I finally let myself breathe a little bit. Jasmine just stared straight ahead, and neither of us spoke for a really long time. Eventually, she broke the silence. "We're never coming back here, right?" I nodded. "Never." We didn't talk about it anymore either. Didn't mention the barn, the painted bodies, the way they looked at us the next morning. But occasionally, late at night, I wonder how many of them were in on this. How long had this been going on? Why the hell were they naked, and what were they gonna do? It was gross, weird, and damn near traumatic. I'm glad we left when we did. There was a time in high school when I felt like I stumbled into a different reality, one that looked the same on the surface but had something rotten underneath it. It started pretty slow, so subtle that I didn't really notice it at first. I just remember the feeling that something was off, like people I'd known for years had been replaced with slightly different versions of themselves. It took place during my junior year. We'd come back from summer break, the usual routine. Seeing friends again and swapping stories about what we did, eased back into school. Everything was normal at first. Our friend group was pretty big, a mix of guys and girls who'd known each other since middle school, some even longer than that. We all weren't really the most popular, but we weren't nobodies either. We had our spots at lunch, our places in the hallways, our usual weekend hangouts. It was a rhythm, a comfort. And then there was Heath. Before that year, he'd been just another guy in the group, a little awkward, a little quiet, somebody who never really stood out, but when he came back that fall, he was different, completely different. He walked with his new confidence, talked a lot louder, laughed harder. He looked the same shaggy brown hair, same average build, but the way he carried himself now was just unrecognizable. It wasn't just confidence, it was control. People started paying attention to him. At first, I thought maybe he just had this kind of personal breakthrough over the summer, you know? Maybe he figured out something about himself that made him a lot more outgoing. But the way people reacted to him now was strange. Friends who used to tease him now hung on every word that came out of his mouth. He started making little jokes, subtle jabs, and instead of brushing them off or firing back, people just took it. accepted it. Now, it wasn't immediate, but over those first few months, I watched more and more of our friends start shifting toward him, like gravitationally, like planets being pulled into orbit. Even some of my closest friends, the ones I trusted the most, started acting different when Heath was around. At first, I just ignored it. We're all kids, right? Maybe I'm just overthinking all of this. But the more I watched, the more I realized that this wasn't normal. Heath wasn't just popular now, he was in control. And then slowly, the control turned into something else, something a lot darker. It took me far too long to realize what it was and what was happening. Too long to understand just how deep it really went. At first, I really didn't mind being around him. He was funny in a way that he never used to be, sharp and quick, always in control of the conversation. He had this way of making you feel like you were in on something. Like if he was paying attention to you, that you really mattered, but if he wasn't, you were nothing. And goddamn, would we spiral without that attention? I started noticing the little shifts in the group. People who used to be loud and opinionated now deferred to Heath. If he interrupted, they stopped talking. If he made a joke at their expense, they laughed right along with him, even when it wasn't that funny, even when it was mean. It was really subtle at first. He started small, getting people to do these little things for him. Hey man, let me copy your homework. I forgot to do it last night. Or, dude, grab me a soda from the vending machine. I don't got any cash. Little favors, things friends might do normally for one another, but it would slowly escalate. One day I watched as Jamie, one of our quieter friends, handed Heath a freshly written English essay. I raised an eyebrow. Dude, is that for him? Jamie looked at me with this weird placid expression and just nodded. Yeah, it's cool. I turned to Heath. Seriously, you're just gonna take his work? Heath grinned. Relax, Jamie wanted to help me. Jamie just nodded again, like he actually believed it. And I started seeing it more and more. Jeremy, who had just gotten his license, drove Heath everywhere. Parker, who had a part-time job, always seemed to be the one paying when everybody went out for food. And then there was the really weird part, the girls. One night we were all at a bonfire party out by the lake. I was sitting with Dylan, one of my closest friends, when I noticed something that kind of made my stomach sick. His girlfriend Sam was sitting next to Heath, and Heath had his hand directly on her thigh. I nudged Dylan. Dude, what the hell is that? Dylan barely even reacted. He just shrugged, staring into the fire. It's cool, man. I blinked. What? Heath leaned back, stretching like he owned the whole damn night. Dylan gets it, he said, smirking. It's just a little fun, not that big of a deal. I looked at Sam, waiting for her to say something now, and she just smiled. But it didn't feel real, like forced, like she was just tolerating it. That's when I knew something was really wrong. I started pulling back after that. I stopped hanging out quite as much and stopped going to every little get-together where Heath was the center of attention. But the problem was, my closest friends were still caught in the middle of it, and the more distance I put between myself and Heath, the more I felt like I was losing them. One day, I made the mistake of saying something. I was sitting in the cafeteria with Dylan and Jeremy, trying to act normal, trying to pretend like everything was okay, but I couldn't let it go. You're telling me you guys really don't think this is weird? I asked, keeping my voice low. I mean, come on. He's got all of you running around for him like you're his servants or something. Jeremy's face just darkened. That's not true. Really? So what, you just want to do his homework? You want to pay for his food? You want to let him mess around with your girlfriend? Jeremy's jaw clenched and Dylan looked away. Look, I said, I'm not trying to start anything. It doesn't make sense. Does this not seem wrong to you? Neither of them answered me. Later that night, I got a text from Dylan. Heath wants to talk to you. I knew it was a bad idea, and I knew I probably should have ignored it, but part of me still thought I could fix things, that maybe I could snap all of them out of whatever weird little spell that they were currently under. I met them at the park after dark that night. It was mostly empty, just a few distant streetlights casting long shadows through the trees. Heath was already there, standing in the center of the basketball court. Dylan, Jeremy, and 2 others, Parker and Jamie, stood nearby. "All right, so what's this all about?" I asked. Heath just smiled. "You've been saying some pretty shitty things, man." I crossed my arms, just calling it like I see it. Heath shook his head and clicked his tongue. "You see, that's the problem. You don't see anything. You're too stuck in your own bullshit to understand what we have here. This is real. This is loyalty." I felt a chill roll through me. Loyalty? Dude, you've turned them into followers. Heath's expression flickered, and just for a second, he took a step closer. "You don't get to talk about us like that. You don't get to judge. You're either with us or you're the enemy." He turned to the others. "And what do we do with the enemies, boys?" Dylan seemed to hesitate. So did Jeremy, but Parker, Jamie, they didn't. The first punch caught me off guard, slamming into my ribs. I stumbled back wheezing, but then another hit me across the jaw. I tasted blood. I tried to run, but hands grabbed me and shoved me back. A fist crashed into my stomach, dropping me to my knees. Someone then kicked me in the ribs, then the balls. I hit the pavement pretty hard, and my vision began to blur. I barely even registered the voices above me. "Enough!" Heath's voice rang out. "Let him go." The hands pulled away, and my body screamed with pain. I managed to lift my head, staring up at Heath. He was crouched beside me, voice low, almost gentle. "You're done here," he murmured. "Don't come back." I just spat out blood onto the pavement. "Fuck you." Heath just smiled back. Then they left, one by one, footsteps fading off into the night. I lay there, staring up at the sky, the stars cold and distant above me. I'd lost them, all of them. I didn't go to school the next day. My face was swollen, my ribs ached with every breath. I knew if I saw them, I saw him, I might lose control again. I might do something stupid. So I stayed home staring up at the ceiling, running it all over my head again. I kept thinking about the way Dylan had looked at me before they started swinging, like he didn't want to do it, like he was waiting for Heath's approval. How the hell did it get to that point? The bruises would fade, but the damage would stick. I completely stopped hanging out with them, stopped sitting with our usual table. I made some new friends and kept my head down. I didn't talk about what happened, and neither did they. And Heath? He kept going. For a while, it was like nothing had changed. He still held court in the halls, still had his little army, still walked around like he owned everything. And I started to think that it would never end. But eventually, something shifted. It was slow at first, just like when it all started. Jeremy stopped driving in places, Parker stopped paying for things, and then Jamie, and then Dylan. Then one day, it was just Heath, all alone. I didn't know what happened. Maybe they finally saw through it, saw who he really was. Maybe whatever spell he had them over just finally wore off, but by the time spring had rolled around, it was like he had never been anything special at all. Just another kid in the hall, and nobody gave him a second look. I should have felt relieved. I should have felt vindicated. But all I felt was unsettled. Heath didn't seem to be mad. He didn't lash out and didn't try to win them back. He just went back to normal. Like none of it ever happened. And for some reason, that part scared me the most. To this day, I still don't know what made him that way for all those months, but I don't know how he got inside their heads. I don't know how he made them worship him. Whatever it was, it left just as suddenly as it arrived. Heath was a loser again, and everybody else pretty much fell back into place. I still think about it though. Sometimes I catch myself thinking, what the hell got into him?